Hello and welcome to this podcast or video series if you're watching on YouTube. I'm with my friend Rashid, and we're going to go through Lectures on Heroes by Thomas Carlyle. This one's going to be about his first lecture, Heroes' Divinity, namely Odin, paganism, Scandinavian mythology, and where did the pagans get their sense of greatness from, what was in Odin that they thought was so great and so on, and also just more broadly what Carlyle's going for when he thinks of the great
this
man.
is the first chapter.
Yeah. So anything in particular that you want to start us off with when we're talking about great man theory?
Yes, especially since our viewers have seen explanations of great man theory on places like YouTube or essays online that I think are, for the most part, just going from the great man theory description on Wikipedia, as far as I can tell from how they are approaching this. Because usually when they're talking about great men, especially in a classroom setting, when they want to get through a lot of information really quickly, they want to simply simplify it as best as they can. And the most simplified version is that great man theory is about how great men are born rather than made, how great men are just naturally great, and that it's mostly nature rather than nurture. I'm quoting all of these from like YouTube videos that I've watched, and in the first 20 seconds of the YouTube videos that I watched. And for the most part, when I was reading Heroes, I haven't seen this as much as they talk about it, because they're talking about it like it was corn law and labor. If you haven't read Labor and Reward, we are going to slightly talk about those as well. So for this video, I would suggest reading Labor and Reward chapters from Past and Present from 1840,
which we have discussions on the YouTube channel. Yeah,
on the YouTube channel and probably on the podcast as well. And also, obviously, Heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history from later, I believe, after Past and Present, since it was a series of lectures.
These lectures are May 1840, to give some context. So it's an interesting point you talk about. And you think it's a deficit in the learning, really, that there's no nurture element to it? Or
it can't be simplified as such, I believe. It can be a part of it. I believe not a significant part of it in the whole grand scheme of things, but it is a part of it. But simply because you have 10 minutes to explain it, that you would just refer to it as such, I believe is wrong, especially with a very broad and very complicated text as Heroes.
And that's kind of what we're
going. It is
not
at all an easy text at all.
Give it some time to flesh it out. Because Carlyle, I think there definitely is a truth in what those 10-minute lecture guys are going for when they talk about, no, you can't breed this sort of greatness, because he does have the passage on time calling forth a great man, and whether that's possible or whether he calls it forth himself. So I think I have it here. It's from Lecture 1, Odin. It says, "The time called forth, alas, we have not known times call loudly enough for their great man, but find him when they called. He was not there. Providence had not sent him. The time calling its loudest had to go down to confusion and wreck because he would not come when called." So Carlyle there is really just going, no, the time doesn't call forward these great men and then they just appear. So it's not a simple, for Carlyle, it's not simple. If you think about that evolution of, weak men breed bad times, and then the great man kind of can step into those bad times. Carlyle does not believe that. He thinks the great man himself will just emerge and create the scene around him rather than the scene awaiting him, and then he slots into the hole that's waiting for him. So in that, I think he would push back against like nurture, because the great man's sort of in Carlyle, like certainly this top tier great men, these 6 that he goes through, Odin being hero as God. I don't think he'd think that like you can't nurture Odin, right? What would you say about that?
Well, I definitely would. I definitely would say you can't nurture an Odin, although he does I get the impression from reading the first chapter that he doesn't actually believe that man can be God. When he says, I lament the end of Odin, I do not think that he means he laments that Odin, we don't think of people as God anymore. I think he laments that we don't have boundless admiration for people anymore. And in that way, obviously you cannot make an Odin. Although I believe there can be a reading of the text and interpretation of the text that would allow for the nurture element to exist within it, even though Carlyle would probably not believe in it. And we will probably talk about that further when we're talking about Emerson's representative man from the third chapter onwards, since they will be more interlining with each other on the topics that they talk about. These first two figures, Odin and Muhammad, are not mentioned in Emerson, or there is definitely not an equivalent person in Emerson. So while we could talk about poet and writer in different people, we cannot talk about God and prophet when Emerson has not talked about those. But yeah, we will talk about representative man more in the future as well, starting from the third series onwards.
And I think it's interesting that Carlyle does go back further, almost to the more primitive modes of hero worship than Emerson. I think Emerson has Plato early on. Is that as far back
Plato
as he goes?
is early as he goes. He does mention Homer in sections, but for the most part, he starts out with Plato. Yeah,
because Carlyle, by going back to Odin, I think and he mentions this quite a lot, what he's going back to is he believes the most sort of childlike setup of man in hero worship. So they're so close to nature. The
childlike yet man. What does he call it? Childlike yet like a man, as courageous as a man, or as grown up as a man.
That's, I think, what he gets from. That's his key takeaway from what Odin and paganism at large could instill in these sort of childlike, as he puts them, peoples. Because I think he is like Emerson in this one more than I think I've seen in other ones of his.
There's so much pantheism in this. It's very
very naturalist, and he seems to take great joy in that when he's describing that this myth kind of represented this, or the whole horn that Thor was drinking at one point was the sea, and he has this passage on Yggdrasil, the tree of life, and he loves these sort of metaphors. So he is thinking the pagan man is wandering around and at such awe in nature that it is like that childlike awe, and then out of that awe, Odin becomes hero as God, can become the first form of hero worship for Carlyle. So it's interesting that he goes back to that, like really tries to really steep himself in nature, whereas Emerson doesn't, even though you would think he would associate himself with that childlike time of man.
Yeah, at least with the first chapter, Carlyle is very much thinking this is the beginning, so I need to go as vague and big as a figure as I can get. I believe, because if you go from this chapter on to the other chapters, you go from God, which Carlyle calls something similar to a giant, because he does mention the Scandinavian philosophy of a giant having formed the earth. The gods killed the giant and created the earth with his body and with his blood. They made the earth and the sea and all these other places, all these other concepts. So he does want to go from a giant to a god, I believe, especially in the way he structures his text. Because if you look at what he's saying, he says that these Scandinavian stories were the basis for some of the things we believe in our Western culture that are much more organized and much more, well, graceful, I guess. Like he does mention.
That's raw, yeah.
He does mention that Shakespeare took influence from Odin's tales. He does.
I like that actually.
Yeah.
He calls Shakespeare's Hamlet a twig from the same branch or that's the sort of metaphor to keep with the Yggdrasil tree of life metaphor he goes with. Yeah,
there's this really interesting concept of a giant giving birth to a god, or forming a god. Like, he thinks that Odin and the old arts and the old stories have given birth to these new gods, new artists, new poets, new philosophers that took it and refined it to a great extent. And that's another way I view the nurture versus nature thing, because there's a lot of nurture within this text. I believe that's a form of nurture, taking something big, vague, but awesome, and taking it what he calls, actually, if I can see it, I believe he says condensed. Give me a second. Giant.
this part in Dante, it seems a natural condensation, spontaneous.
Oh yeah.
And that's what I was thinking. Like, how much, though, you say it's nurture, but how much does I think Carlyle thinks perhaps this is just like an intrinsic inheritance almost. This, you're not conscious of it. It's something that just seeps into your being almost. This greatness, well, perhaps not my being, being like Dante. He's not like Dante's not looking at Odin certainly and saying, I need to model myself off that. Though he is looking at others, he's looking at Virgil. He certainly has his framework that he has to work from.
So I would ask you, do you think that society itself starts cultivating and condensing this giant into a god? If it's not the guy, if it's not the person that's taking what he knows and taking these vague concepts and putting it forth with his genius, then what do you see as doing it?
Well, let's go back to the metaphor Carlyle had in Labor, when he talks about space being this vast empty chaos, and then the planets form into something solid. You can see that as a condensation or a condensing movement, and that for me is more like what I think is going on here. Like, the planets don't read a script and then figure out how to form and condense into something. And so similarly, these sort of great men are having that condensing effect on their works and on their life, but it's not something that they're actively thinking that they're doing while it's happening. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does go a bit into what I said with nature itself sort of condensing via society and what society thinks is important. Like, Wednesday apparently came from Odin's Day, although I haven't fact-checked this.
No, I think that's fairly well established. It's a lingering passage, and Carlyle tries to give you some other parts that linger on, though I think some may have faded out in the 180 years since this lecture. So, like, there was when he talks about Nottingham bargemen still believing in the deep sea or water giant Aegir, which I love that image of Carlyle getting on a barge somewhere around on the Trent River, and these bargemen just still believing in these Old Norse giants could be lurking below. I just find that quite charming. It's almost like Carlyle talks here about naive people being back closer to nature, even though that was still in industrial England, 1840. There's still like these people who were in these states of mind, which I find closer affiliates that natural state than what you'd find today. Yeah. So yeah, he has those little nuggets that he tries to give you.
Okay, I think we should go on to summarize certain parts of the text.
Yeah,
so especially if someone's here because they didn't really understand it reading it the first time, I think it would be all right. So he starts with explaining what great men are. Simply that the world's history is simply the outer realization of the efforts of great men. The actual quote is longer, but I condensed it into that. And quite a lot of people online just see that as, so it's almost like a grab-all of everybody's efforts into the loudest person whose name is recorded into the history. Some people view it as such, but if you actually look within the text itself, Carlyle is in no way discarding the efforts of his followers. Actually, he valorizes a lot of the followers' efforts, especially in the Scandinavian, how he views Scandinavian philosophy of life, that is of courage as absolutely crucial thing in life. So he does not discard the efforts of the followers. He actually valorizes them. So this is not quite the way you should view the world's history, is simply the outer realization of the efforts of great men. The great men weren't just trying to hog all the credit for themselves, in Carlyle's opinions. And so he goes on to state that even if you make a very flawed study of great men, it's still a great way to learn, basically. He says that great men are profitable to learn from, since even a half-hearted approach to learning from them, you will still have benefited, because what he calls studying great men is staring into the light. There's a lot of that light imagery in this essay, especially. He goes on to explain how the light can actually grow into this big thing without even the efforts of the great man, through the myths and allegories that are made of them. And he goes on to, he makes that clear. The whole quote is, properly the outer material result, practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great man sent into the world. Soul of the whole world's history is this, he says. He does mention it is the living light fountain, which
that's
is
exactly
pleasant to be
the
near.
quote I was going to go for. Like, the great man is the living light fountain. I think if you're going to start from nowhere about Carlyle and great men, that's what you should think about, where he's getting from. It's the living light fountain, right? So it's a light fountain, so it's shining light on things that otherwise man, or the mundane man, the everyday man, would not have seen. So it's kind of like the great man can shine a light on things. For instance, in the paganism, what comes from that great shining of the light is the installation of a sort of valor code or an honor system, which pagan people had gotten from the end. But before that, it was kind of darkness around the installation of that sort of system. So I definitely think that is the good place to start, that great man is the living light fountain. And also, I think early on he does talk a lot about allegories and how,
oh my goodness,
he thinks allegories all come from a kernel of truth, or a cornerstone of truth that people did then genuinely believe in at one point. So even though you can look, say, at the Bible today, or at some of these old pagan mythos that Carl does in this lecture, and you can pick out allegories, this represents this part and this nature. To the people living them, though, they weren't allegories. That's certainly the Carlyle position.
Yeah.
And that they believed them when they were there. And that, for Carlyle, that undoes the falsehood or the quackery of a belief that he mentions as well. So like a quackery belief will get no flourishment at the other side. So I think if you were to believe in the wrong great man or something, you wouldn't get either the valor system or something. It would beget nothing, right?
It wouldn't have a rich history to it.
Yeah.
It would just be something that began and died in one place at one time. And the whole allegory stuff, it's actually very interesting. Great many times, especially. Have you been raised in a religious household by any chance?
No, it was fairly irreligious. I mean, like, quietly Christian, Quaker, more than anything else, but like not rigidly. So
I haven't been raised in that rigid of a religious family as well, but I did have experiences where I talked to religious figures, and most of the time understanding is that when they're talking about religions other than Islam, and I believe that's true for like other religious sects as well, when they're talking about religions other than the one they are in, they are usually taking this approach that Carlyle states, which is that just like how we think of Odin or the Greek gods as these weird religion that we can't really understand why people would like, why people would revere and worship, and our immediate assumption would be that, you know, only idiots worshipped it, and people who are trying to trick them sort of sold it to them so they would give them power or whatever they wished for. This is sort of the first understanding of religions that Carlyle debunks, with him saying that people don't believe in quackery because they have this instinct towards understanding fraud. It's kind of like the saying that you can fool all the people some of the time, you can fool some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all people all of the time. So I think it's kind of like that, but said in a less catchy manner, I guess. And yeah, so this is the first thing he debunks, and then the second thing he debunks is what you say, that most of these things were just allegories. People didn't just wanted to have a placeholder for understanding how rain worked or how the river flew. They just made these stories up to like tell kids that this is how things could work, and if they don't understand it, it's fine. But Carlyle didn't believe in that. He didn't believe that people didn't believe in a god and they didn't have this strict honor code, or that they didn't really care about courage as much as just saying that courage might be something interesting to think about. I mean,
the adult telling the kid that like story isn't just telling the kid from a cynical point of view. The adult is telling the kid from a point of view of genuine belief. And then that's what makes it this living truism. And I think, it's very interesting what you say there about Carlyle. Like, okay, is it a little bit of a cop-out? He starts with paganism and then Islam because he's too afraid to touch perhaps like Christian figures at this time, maybe. But I actually think what comes from it is something kind of unique, because you don't have another Victorian thinker like tackling paganism or Mohammedanism like this. I
think it was kind of controversial that he covered Muhammad. I think one critic,
because you're meant to just see him as a heathen, like carte blanche. How dare you consider him in this light? Even though the light is like, again, he's not saying let's convert everybody. It's not similar to, he's not saying let's convert everyone to paganism in lecture 1.
Yeah, he's not even saying let's convert everyone to
he's treating him with a truth and an earnestness, I think, that would have taken people aback.
Yeah, there's a critic that writes, the critic writes that he's quite taken with Muhammad. He talks about his black eyes like some girl. So that's very interesting. But his lectures were quite a hit, I believe, when they first came out. So people did find him interesting, at least. So yeah, he does talk about allegory. It cannot be just an allegory. I don't think he gives like a proof of what he's saying, but we can sort of understand it, and whether we believe it or not.
There was an interesting part as well where he brings in Voltaire briefly as a sort of great man in a more quackery style setting. And I think, because he calls what Voltaire cultivates is persiflage, or like this sardonic, not taking the world seriously or chiping at something. There's a great earnestness which is absent from Voltaire, and I think he associates that with great man as quackery. There's parts in the French Revolution, I think possibly he talks about Voltaire later in the lecture 5 when he talks about the hero as man of letters. He tries to compare him, say, against a Dr. Johnson. In that it's just, you can tell there's a kind of a real disgust behind when he starts talking about Voltaire, that because the French poured this greatness into this man, and I think Carlyle just believes that absolutely unworthy of it. Unlike an Odin, unlike a Muhammad. So I think that he does admit there that there can be a sort of a cult status around somebody who is unworthy of it, and usually he associates something unworthy with something which is perhaps lacking in sincerity or earnestness. That word persiflage just kind of stood out at me. It's in Pound's, when Pound is talking about sort of the decaying Western values after the First World War, persiflage and the truth is like this line Pound gives at you, which is sort of his scorn of watching people in the 1920s not understanding how they're just out partying or enjoying this or that when the world had just come asunder only 5 years earlier or something. So that word persiflage really stuck with me.
Yeah, he does mention that, especially in the earnest part, not sport, but earnest is what we should require. Is what another thing he talks about when he talks about how allegory is not the beginning point for these religions, because allegory is for the most part a sport. And no one, he says, risks their lives for sport. No one dies for sport. People can be really into tennis, but they won't, well, they won't die to like play a song, or they won't die to paint a painting. Especially they won't die to like preserve a painting. You give someone a priceless Picasso or a Rubens and tell them that you either throw that off a cliff or you die, they will throw that off without a second thought. What people care about is earnest, I believe, earnest belief and earnest belief system that can actually be, that's actually worthy.
Yeah, and I think when he kind of wants to strip away sport, I think he is appealing to a kind of in a classical tradition there of the idea that bread and circuses is almost a form of decadent culture, that it should be taken away if you want to grapple with the truth of something, right? So his disgust at sport is similar to his sort of the disgust you would have at bread and circuses. Though, ironically enough, that term comes from Juvenal, who's kind of a satirist. So I don't know what Carlyle would have made of Juvenal. But yeah, I just think that's an interesting model. Like a Victorian of 1840, what would he make of this, or how big sport has become in our current age? I don't know what he'd take of that. He'd just mere quackery. How many times would you say quackery in one sentence? I'm not sure.
I believe he stopped saying it after the first part. He does say it a lot in the first part, right? But I think he stops at some point. It's not like corn law at all. Yeah. It's not like corn law at all, where it's just sort of like you're just reading a sentence on a woman going shopping and then corn law. It's just, corn law really does come up everywhere in past and present. That's what we are referencing here. Anyhow, so we managed to keep that contained within the allegory discussion, which is good. We didn't just jump into discussing the last parts of the essay. So we will go on to, from our synopsis to quickly, we will have to address that allegories do exist. He doesn't say that allegories don't exist or that allegories are unimportant, but he does say that belief leads to allegories rather than allegories leading into belief. You know?
Yes, that's crucial.
I believe, yeah. They must have believed in that supreme reality before they could make supreme allegories in paintings and poetry and so forth. He doesn't mean that these stories that have come down to us have come down from the very beginning of the tales. Later on, he talks about some Norse tales, and he specifically mentions that they must have come from the late periods of Scandinavian culture. So yeah, we got that over with, the allegory talk. And okay, he then goes into how we view nature, which is what we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And this is the part where he gets into this Emersonian spirit of pantheism almost. Especially
very Emersonian. I was kind of taken aback when I was rereading it, because I've been reading, I think when I first read this, I hadn't read Emerson. And then when I was reading this back over for this stream, I kind of have had Emerson essays on and off for the last few times. And I was thinking, oh, this is why Emerson would have been enamored with Carlyle at the time, right? Because this would have been the association that sparked that relationship, I think, when he sees these sort of... Yeah.
when you were first reading this section, did you think this is not my Carlyle? Something like that?
No, I think I was genuinely, when I first read this, I hadn't been exposed to much Carlyle at all. So like on a very first reading of Odin, I was just like, how is he coming up with a framework for great men? Or how is he putting that genie in the bottle sort of thing? For me, it was interesting. I'm always interested when someone tries to tackle a situation like that and tries to codify something almost, or tries to pick out the parts that you can understand a framework around. So it's like, okay, Odin, don't know much about Odin. Let's see what Carlyle has to say, sort of thing. But looking back, the nature was, and that's how he leads into Odin, I think, because he talks about the pagan people had wonderment at many things that we wouldn't today, or even in Carlyle's time. And then everything was almost a miracle. And he does bring in Plato, which kind of might be interesting later for when Emerson uses Plato. But the man from Plato's cave, when he gets released from the cave, everything is sort of a miracle, even though it's what normal day, right, to anyone else. And what he's saying is that experience of that man coming out of that cave is kind of like how the pagans were experiencing the world. So I think then he feeds that sort of wonderment into Odin, and like that's how he kind of drips down the lecture to get to Odin. I don't know if you agree with that. That's certainly how I found he was trying to like crystallize the wonderment, and then you get to time being always something that's, we still can't quite understand time. So we sometimes when we think about time, we're still thinking in that element of wonder that everyone had and in pagan times. And then, of course, it's great men that Carlyle linked earlier. The time does not call them forth, they call the time forth. So the great man is almost someone who can wield time if you think about people viewing the world in that wonderment phase, the great man can wield time, and that's why we are so captivated by them. And I thought, if I was reading back trying to figure out like how he leads into the great men from the naturalist phase, from the Emersonian phase, I think that's how he does it.
Yeah, definitely. The beginning of the argument of Odin starts like 10 or 15 pages before he even starts talking about Odin in its stories and so forth. The stories are almost like an afterthought at the last few pages. Other than that, he very much crystallizes this idea and tries to explain how a person can weave a man as God. But before he can get to man, he talks about how the concept of God and the concept of worship comes about to a person. And he starts explaining that, but like you said, with the allegory of the cave, he says that if a man came out of the cave and saw all these wonders, wouldn't he worship them? Wouldn't he think them as his God? And he does say that nowadays, to appreciate nature, we need something like a prophet, because we have in his words, we have hidden away everything in these scientific nomenclatures, and we have given names to everything, so we think we understand them. This is the type of looking into what he calls childlike, yet has grown up as a man. I still don't remember that quote exactly, but he does think that the childlike wonder have helped these real men understand the world in much broader sections than some of us understand it, and some of us view it, especially in his time and in our time right now.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the nomenclature or the sort of compartmentalization of things that Carlyle would have detested, because I think, not that he would detest it, but he'd think that there's a time and a place for it, and there's a time and a place where you can't do that. So being overly scientific in parts that don't warrant it, I think, is where he's taking disgust from. And then it's not grappling the truth. The whole point of science is that you can obtain a truth from it. But if you try and use the methods of the laboratory in a real world setting, or in a setting that Carlyle thinks is, can contain this idea of wonderment, awe, belief in miracles, and so on, then you're never going to get the truth. You're never going to get the correct answer from it. I might just address, we got a question in the YouTube chat.
Cool.
About what do you think about Carlyle's criticism of capitalism? We kind of discussed this in the last one.
Yes, we did discuss it in Reward, I believe.
I think, and it comes from this idea of Carlyle's concerned about how do you create something compact and something solid from chaos. And I think he would have lived through a very chaotic period of English history where capitalism did look like it was, creating slums in the cities. The conditions of the poor was bad. The whole point of Past and Present is him trying to deal with the condition of England question, which is really is this industrial capitalism that we're seeing leading to a worse method of life. So I think his critique largely there comes from a little bit of medieval romanticism, because at the time you've got still an early Tennyson, an early Walter Scott novels and so on, looking back to a feudal time as something at least more concrete, and the interactions between people was much more better understood, and people knew their place in society. And then as a Calvinist, that appeals to Carlyle, right? People knowing their place in society. So I think that's where he's coming from. And when you picture him trying to grapple with that question of where England's going, and it's in such a state of flux, I think it's a lot of his critique is quite understandable.
Yes.
So overall, I'd have time for it, but I think capitalism did after that move in a way that Carlyle would never have foreseen. So it would be interesting to know his critiques of it. I'm sure he'd still have lots of critiques of it today. But
he would have critiques of it, but I think the notion that capitalism itself can't create wealth and can't really pull people up from poverty, especially in the way that he talks about these, what he called mammons. He talks about profit motive can't create wealth and can't make people happy. But nowadays we know that profit motive actually can create wealth and can create capital. There you can have criticism.
But he would consider the mammon a quackery, I think.
Yeah.
He would definitely, he would fall that under quackery, mammonism, or the worship of mammon, as opposed to a worship of an Odin, for instance.
Although I don't think he would just criticize capitalism the same way he would have done it in the 1800s. No. As we have a much better hindsight of what happens when we...
Where it's going.
He might give more like spiritual answers rather than more concrete answers like he does in Past and Present. But that's what we can say about capitalism. It's
perhaps there's something there for another stream. Like you can definitely flesh that out.
Yeah, we can another stream. We can talk about the economic aspects of Carlyle and what he believed in, especially when it comes to work and how you view work and how you view wages. But this is mostly
I'd say go
about heroes.
Yeah, I'd say check out the part 2 of the labor and reward ones we did, right? We talks about reward from the reward chapter of Past and Present. Okay.
Yeah, what should be the reward for labor? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we were mostly going through summarizing what happens and also giving our opinions on it. And the last thing we have given opinions was that Carlyle views that nowadays we need prophets for stripping off these poor, undevout rapages, nomenclatures, and scientific hearsay. So he thinks that nowadays we are so ingrained in these that we need prophets and people to people giving TED Talks to give us to explain to us what is nature, and usually they do a terrible job and they use horrendous vocabulary. Anyhow, but that's what he believes is happening, especially when you contrast how we view the world with how Scandinavians view the world. Okay, so he goes in from this nature to explain that, okay, so nature is godlike. Everything in nature has this force in it. He even says a rotting leaf has a force. How else could it rot? So he goes from nature to say that, well, if nature has a force, then what is the most important part of nature? And that is, of course, man. He says nature's perfect specimen or the perfect creation of nature is man. Therefore, isn't it the most logical thing is to worship man? That's how he goes into
that's very good.
God as man, hero as man. Hero's god. Yeah.
It's interesting to talk about the rotting leaf as well, because I think I mentioned this on either the labor reward stream we did. You had to compare Carlyle's view against, say, Spengler, who thought that everything was cyclical and there was rise and decay in civilizations like a leaf, and Spengler explicitly takes the leaf motif from Goethe. But Carlyle, I don't think, would believe that, because he believes too much in agency. So it's like, if you have a passive people, then you'll fall into the leaf, the rotting leaf, right? That things will just decay and disintegrate. But if you have agency, mainly through great actors, then you can withstand that. And I think he even talks later about how he has a lot on etymology here and where words come from and so on. And when he talks about Odin, he talks about it comes from an old German Wotan, which he attributes to movement, right? So think of men of movement. So Odin could be one of those. Odin instilled in the pagan people something which kind of made them go away from a simple rotting leaf motif. So I just thought that twinned nicely with where Carlyle stands as opposed to Spengler. Yeah.
He does mention that Odin in the old Scandinavian philosophy is seen as someone who brought writing, someone who brought poetry, someone who brought the arts, someone who brought music. So in a way, he does, in their philosophy, brought them from this dark ages to the new age, this rotting leaf into new life, I guess. So he goes from explaining that man can be God because he is the ultimate specimen of nature, to explaining that, in a way, the hero worship in the whole ancient system of thought. He gives the allegory of the Yggdrasil tree. I don't know if I said that correctly. Yggdrasil.
Yggdrasil, I think.
Yggdrasil. Oh, anyhow, Yggdrasil.
I'll just let you roll with it.
Yeah, I'll just roll with it, and you'll spell it correctly, and people will understand what I'm talking about. He does give an example of what Yggdrasil stands for and how it's partitioned with the world of death, world of life, and how the tree has it all inside of it in different sections.
I liked that imagery as well, that it kind of represents where man is on the plane of life. The tree goes down and hits the depths of Hela, or death, right? The literal symbology of death in Norse mythology. But it also reaches up towards the divinities, towards, well, like what would have been there, Asgard. But I liked that fact that it's like looking upward. It's very spiritual. It's very Carlyle, and rather than the materialist would only look horizontally, rather than looking down and looking above themselves. So I thought it was a really nice metaphor.
Yeah, you definitely understand it better than I do. I had some trouble with understanding this because, I don't know the stuff that you know, obviously, but also it sort of feels like he just stops talking about what he's talking about and starts talking about this different allegory, explains it, and
I think he starts picking out, like, there was a truth in Odin and the runes and so on, and then he's like, and I also like all these other things that are in pagan mythos, and then he just goes straight into Yggdrasil. Like it's
what I got from Yggdrasil was that he talks about the roots of society, and he says that obviously within the roots there's nature worship and trying to understand nature, but if you look at the deepest root, he says that the deepest root was hero worship. He says society was founded on hero worship. It is the deepest root, for paganism sprang. We may say, out of many roots, every adoration of a star or natural object was a root. But hero worship is the deepest root, from which in a great degree all the rest were nourished and grown. So, he mentions that the hero worship is the deepest root, and then when goes on to explain that it doesn't quite connect to Yggdrasil. Do you think it connects to Yggdrasil that well? Because he goes on to explain that this is because if you look at most religions, most religions are hero worship in one way or the other. He says, faith is loyalty to some inspired teacher. So how do you view that?
It's a bit. I think he is trying to, when he keeps the root, he's trying to keep the tree metaphor alive, but it is a little clunky, right? Because in the basic Yggdrasil one, the roots are going down to hell. So I don't know then how you could say the hero worship is the root. So it's a little clunky, and I think I think a lot of part of that was just he just liked the Yggdrasil metaphor. He liked what it represented in paganism, and he just wanted to go. See, paganism also gave us this thing, which was great. And then he just kind of put it in his lecture. I think that's what he was probably going for.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he says that explains that all religions are in a way faith to an inspired teacher, a great man, as to say. And he goes on from explaining that heroism is the root of everything to explaining how critics view heroism, which is what we talked about at the beginning of this, but we can sort of go into it a little bit more here, which is that they say that he was the product of the time. I love the way you read this. By the way, anyone listening, John has a wonderful audiobook made of the entire Heroes books, and I was reading it. I was listening to it in my car. And I loved how you said, when people are trying to dismiss the hero, they say, he was the product of his time, they say. The time called him forth. The time did everything. He, nothing. You actually read it like that, which is really fun.
Yeah. I just get... part of that, where that came from, was when I was reading these, I had this great voice of this lecture in my head, like this thundering Scotsman. And I was like, I just kind of have to crystallize it, like maybe through audio form, because I'll just get more out of it. Kind of what led me towards doing.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most interesting parts of the audiobook. That, and also the way you pronounce Brobdingnag.
What did I get wrong? I can't remember.
Well, actually, it's in the text 3 times, I believe, and you nail it 1 time. That's amazing.
Oh, Brobdingnag.
The other time it takes you.
See it here.
Brobdingnag actually comes from Gulliver's Travels. That's the one reference that I understood. Brobdingnag is the Gulliver's Travels. He first goes to the Lilliput with the small people, and the second island he goes to is Brobdingnag, which is the land of giants. And the third land and the fourth land, he goes to Laputa, like the flying place, and then the horses. There, Gulliver Travels. People usually only remember either the first part or the second part, but it's got 5 parts, I think, or 4 parts. And
I've never read it cover to cover. I've only seen your classic adaptations, your classic tellings, and so on. And it's always him in the little
Jack Black movie.
I have not seen the Jack Black movie, nor will I. I know. I do need to read some Swift. It's definitely on the list.
Yeah, he's underappreciated, I believe. Anyhow, so yeah, Brobdingnag comes from that. And what were we talking about? We were talking about how the criticism of the great man theory is seen. And, they say that it was a product of his time. He did nothing. The time did everything. Carlyle, I thought, was being a little sulky when I first read this, but then I thought, wait, he's not saying that people say that he actually did nothing. He's just saying that people think that his accomplishments could have been done by anybody else, because they're giving all the credit to time. And time has to get someone to actually do the work. They're not saying the work shouldn't have been done. They're saying that he was replaceable. He could just, if he didn't do it, time would have got somebody else. And his rebuttal for it is very interesting. He says that if time was so great at getting the right people at the right time, why are we going to chaos all the time? Why is there chaos happening over and over again? Why did people tell us to wear masks or not wear masks for the first 2 weeks, and then told us masks were crucial?
It's like post-hoc rationalism, right? So after the event, because it's after the event, you pick the nadir of the event when somebody showed up who corrected it, and then say, well, they came in because that was the nadir. But the only reason that's the nadir is because they came in. If they were not there, things would have continued to get more chaotic. And then when someone came in at a lower point, you would have gone, well, that was obviously the point at which someone came in. So that's what he's getting at there.
We didn't tell you to wear masks because we thought you'd hoard them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When that came out.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, he says time isn't so great at finding like great people. It's never when they call it, when they call it the loudest, people don't come as the way as how you're thinking of the subject. Time goes into confusion and wreck, he says.
I think if you let's take for instance French Revolution, which I'm going through, and Carlyle has gone through his work on the channel. It takes a long time for Napoleon to appear, and there's almost a decade of just chaos descending. Like, first of all, there's Bastille 1789, but then it takes 3 or 4 years to then get rid of the monarch, execute the monarch, then execute the people who executed the monarch. Goes through great turmoil until the great man appears and can stop the revolution.
Yeah.
So I just think it's an interesting point. It's like showing you the depths you can go into when you open the door of chaos.
Yeah, he does say that, while time does go into chaos, like you mentioned, from chaos, it can build itself back up through hero worship. He says, okay, the time cannot call a hero at the right time to prevent chaos, but in order to come back from chaos, it needs hero worship. And that's where he talks in a very authoritative voice that hero worship is going to endure no matter what happens. Which is kind of interesting. It's like it's always going to be there. You can't destroy it, which is interesting. Which is an interesting statement. Do you think he says that, or
there's definitely? Oh yeah, he definitely believed that hero worship is something perennial. It's true no matter where you are in time. But it is interesting to think about that and then think about the world. I actually think, the world like immediately after the Second World War, right, from your 1950s through to maybe even a decade ago, people believed that they were past that. Social theory, political social sciences would have taken a very different method of studying these sort of things than Carlyle and hero worship, and they believed it to be dead. They believed it to be a misguided belief that ended in sort of Hitler's devotion, because Hitler had Carlyle's. Did he have this one in particular on hero worship? No, I think he had a copy of his biography of Frederick the Great. Yeah, that was it.
I haven't read it, but
some people associated with that wrong avenue or that cul-de-sac. It was a mode of thought that ended in a cul-de-sac for people. So for ages, people tried to bury it, but I do think they're you could say the roots are to go back to roots. For anyone who's thinking of just throwing an author away because their works were read by a dictator and liked, you should know that Ralph Waldo Emerson's works were both read by communist dictators who killed their own people, and also people who were supporting abolition. So definitely you can take philosophical works, especially ones that don't really look into making these, what he says, scientific nomenclatures that are, undoubtable. You can take these works to mean whatever they want, whatever you want it to be. So I don't usually go after a writer that I like because they're also being liked by a dictator or a fascist or a communist. It's very varied. You can make a lot of these works. You can make whatever you think of them. Ralph Waldo Emerson, I believe, had to specify at some point of his career that self-reliance was a reliance on God, because people kept using self-reliance to say, well, I'm abusing my workers because I'm self-reliant. I'm looking towards building me. Self-reliance. Yes. Where you're going.
So people do use Carlyle to say, oh, he was read by these guys and those guys. I don't think that's
it's funny that in and of itself is kind of, it's the opposite of hero worship, but it's still a fixation upon this great character that looms over your psyche. in a way, oh, I'm not reading that person because they read by this, they were sort of admired by this other person. So that other person is sort of looming over your psyche, even if you don't, not seeing them in an aspirational viewpoint. It's still just a figure of a single man completely dominating your whole worldview, which Carlyle would probably find quite ironic.
Anyhow, so we go from that digression to, well, he does spend like a few paragraphs saying, oh no, nobody believes in hero worship. He doesn't say nobody believes in hero worship, but it's very sad that people don't believe in hero worship. It's very, he says, it shows their littleness of mind that they don't believe in themselves and they don't believe in heroes. They don't. It's a sign of low self-esteem. It's kind of what he says. What I got from what he says, and after that, if you have anything to talk about in that sense, I rather just go into Odin finally, because we haven't talked about Odin in all this talk.
Yeah, you can head on into Odin there.
Yeah, he says that not believing in great men is a way of lowering your self-esteem, which can be debated, but I kind of see it as just a little digression until we get to the main point of hero worship. Since this is the first chapter, it's kind of understandable that we would talk about hero worship in general before we go into Odin. From the second chapter onwards, he goes directly onto the person rather than talking.
Yeah, there's a lot in this which kind of Odin's in it, right? But actually, he's more concerned with stuff we have touched upon. The wonderment that's contained within paganism, how you get from that wonderment into the reverence of a great man, and so on. So I think we have dealt with it in our own way. But yeah, let's go in. Let's focus in a little bit on the characteristics.
He talks about Voltaire. You mentioned that. We already know what he says. And then he goes into explaining, Scandinavian view of nature as this a large, awkward gianthood that you have to cultivate. And he goes into Odin. And he goes into Scandinavian thought, which is, he mentions the compact greatness. As opposed to, when we're talking about cultivating greatness and cultivating gods in general from giants. And he says that for nowadays, when you see a poet, when a poet that comes about and articulates in a way that makes everyone else suddenly see the world in a different light, we call that person a poet or a genius nowadays. But back then, they were a seer. They were a prophet. They saw these people as prophet. So if you knew how to play the violin or whatever they had in a different way and make something really interesting out of it, you would be seen as a prophet rather than just as an artist that learned this new way of making music.
Just bring it back as well. That these are all, Carl thinks these are all just different terms, different acceptable linguistic phrases for the time of what's the same thing, which is that the light living fountain that we had earlier. That really genius, prophet, seer, these are all living light fountains.
Yes, and he expands on that living light fountain metaphor in this one. When he talks about how the light someone gives out when they're alive actually grows, especially when there are no books around for people to just write down facts, that their image grows in 10 or 30 years. You'll see that once everybody who knew him died, their deeds just grow into these big myths that broaden the light in his mind. He doesn't think the light gets contaminated by people making myths about what they did, but he sees that as broadening of the light, and he sees the center as the truth. And when he talks about there being truth in allegories, he talks about that center in that broad light. What do you think about that metaphor?
Yeah, I think it largely works. I think I like the fact Odin is known as the seer, right? And to see you're receiving light, or so to speak. So that's kind of associates with the light living fountain element of it.
How is he known as the seer? What does he do? Marvel movies haven't
Oh,
taught me so.
you might be going beyond my belief. I'm not sure exactly what. More just like that he is a seer, that he has a vision. It's sort of like a general wisdom, right? So he's like sort of a god of knowledge.
Oh, okay. So he brings about all these things like writing and arts because he's the seer. He's the all
Yeah,
knowledgeable
that's what I believe.
figure.
It's just like a wisdom, general wisdom, just associated with his character. But he is still have that association with war and battle, because paganism will link, like a victory on a battlefield will also be seen as a seer, right, to the pagan who has to still win his own territory from various different forces, be it natural, be it other men, and so on. So I think he is just kind of that encapsulation of wisdom, that you can survive this harsh environment. And then that's what Carlyle does get from eventually, is that wisdom, that seer, it's going to crystallize itself in the idea of valor, the concept of valor in old paganism. So that's what I think of when I think of Odin as the seer. It's just more that why. The things about Odin, though, is that he takes on the guise of the wanderer as well, in Norse mythology. And I'm trying to square that with where Carlyle goes with it, because I don't think it's something he brings up a lot. The fact Odin could often be in disguise and things like this. Like, I don't know why. Maybe he attributes it to the idea. He talks about how Odin perhaps was. There's someone called Snore. I'm not even sure who it is, who attributes Odin as coming in from the Black Sea. Carlyle talks about this about 70 BC, and then Carlyle laughs the fact he came up with the year 70 BC. It's like, no, Odin's way older than that. He's steeped in people's understanding.
Otherwise, Emerson started even earlier than Carlyle did.
Yeah, nobody uses
Although
an example of
that is historical. I don't know if that is historical. I don't think people.
I don't people don't know. I think generally they don't know.
Yeah.
Like, he uses the Edda as a source.
Usually, you can tell you can have like a oldest point that you can think of when you talk about historical people, but you would have to check that somewhere.
No, Odin emerges out of mythos. Like, you can't really put a date on it.
Yeah,
but I don't know how the Wanderer squares with the Great Man, though, because a Wanderer he's just sort of quietly observing, right, wandering through life. So that is something that does square a little bit with me.
That is interesting. I think it's kind of like his works and his myths as crystallizing him as a god. I think he first mentions that as well. He says that, how was Odin exactly? Like, what was the Odin, the person? Because he makes a clear distinction between the real person, Odin. He does believe
it was a person, yeah.
He does believe there was a real person of Odin, but he thinks like, okay, we have all these myths, we have all these incredible things, but what was the real person like? He doesn't at all believe that Odin was a god, obviously, but he is very interested in what the real person Odin might have done. And he gives, I believe, a few theories about what might have happened. He says that he might have been this lord that brought about new... he conquered certain places and brought about new advancements in their...
bring back technology, maybe, or some workings or things like this. And I think he has as well a crucial, that the man Odin, speaking with a hero's voice and heart, as with an impressiveness out of heaven. So he speaks. I think the ability to have a great oratory about you to captivate people is an essential quality. So you speak as if you're out of heaven, and you told people of the infinite importance of valor, how man thereby became a god, and his people, feeling a response to it in their own hearts, believed this message of his. So he kind of, I think, if it is the man we're talking about and how he becomes a god in people's eyes, a huge part of that is oratory and the ability to captivate an audience. Speak as if you have a message from heaven, which is quite linked to Muhammad as well, which is coming up in lecture 2.
Indeed. He does exalt him like he exalts a writer, or it's kind of like a natural writer, where he doesn't write anything, but his works and his life leads to great work, which is another way of weaving the giant being torn apart to make a god or make an earth. Making a god out of a giant. Yeah, that's... and then after he talks about the metaphor he just talked about, I believe he talks about how he goes on to explain a little bit about how we still see traces of Odin nowadays.
Yeah, this is like the
the
Nottingham
Jack the
barge
Giant
that I
Killer.
mentioned as well. Yeah, Jack the Giant Killer. Yeah, yeah.
Jack the
Anything with
Giant Killer.
giants in general, I think he likes to think has its certainly in like Northern Europe has its roots in that Norse idea of Jotunheim or the Jotuns. Just yeah. So in general, when he sees tackling giants, I don't know how much do you square this. Is the tackling of the giant a grappling with chaos for the pagan? Is that what it symbolizes in Carlyle's
tackling of the giant tackling with the pagan?
No, is the
he
tackling
tackles,
of chaos,
I believe, the old
tackling of chaos. So, like, if the pagan tackling with the giants and the Jotuns, is that to Carlyle like man grappling with the chaos of the world?
Oh yeah, definitely. He does. Thor at the last story does say to King, I don't remember it, but the Christian king that was trying to make all Scandinavians into Christians. He does say, I created. Did I break or?
No, you're good.
Okay, so he does say the Christian king Thor when he shows up on the very last tale of like Scandinavian mythology that he appears in. He says that I battled so many giants and I did so many things to create the land that you're sitting on, yet you feel like you need to throw me away. So definitely, I think the stories that involve Thor going over like a giant or like tackling giants, sometimes tackling these big forces, even if he like fails, he does create 3 hills in that story, for instance. So they do definitely mention that these gods are their way of tackling chaos and their way of explaining chaos as well. Because when you look down to it, they didn't have any sciences. They had to use these metaphors to understand the world. And that was what Carlyle says was their reality. The allegories were their reality. They believed in them. They did not believe them to be quackery. And they were not quackery in that these cultures managed to persevere. So yeah, that is a way of seeing the religion.
Is there any other part to Odin in particular that you think stood out? I mentioned that idea that Carlyle thinks comes from the old German Wotan, which he attributes to movement. Mm-hmm. So Odin, as well as being a great orator, is a man of movement and a sort of a doer in the world. Which
Can you explain that a little further? Because I kind of had trouble understanding that Wotan and
so Wotan is like an old Germanic name for Odin. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And then Wotan, Carlyle, I'm not sure exactly the etymology where Carlyle's coming from, but he's saying Wotan means movement in that language. So they're almost calling Odin like movement. He almost is the personification of movement. So like the greatness they see in him is someone who's acting and who can create stuff. Yeah.
That's like another reason why he reveres courage so much, I guess. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And there's valor, there's courage to face. Like again, valor comes from Odin. His installation into people, the idea of valor is crucial, and he does that because he's willing to act out in the world. Hence the movement part of it. So yeah, it does all link together. But other than that, I don't think I have much on in specifically Odin that he talks about here that we haven't already covered.
Odin, Thor more than Odin, I believe, is the star of this essay because he gets to be in the stories that he mentions. And as we said, we don't need to like go into the stories as much. I believe there's an extra credits video on the stories that the exact stories that Carlyle mentions here. So if anyone's interested and don't want to read like this entire essay, they could go and check that out. They
all come from the Icelandic Edda songs as well, which I think is why he liked to use Norse mythology, because he had that work. He had a clear work he could go from, that he could base off. Whereas other pagan beliefs, it would be less so, right? If he had gone for Celtic pagan beliefs, it would have been more difficult. But here he had the one crystallized work or collection of works, because it comes from mythos. But he had something solid that he could grapple with.
Yes, the stories that he mentions involve Thor dealing with these giants, these forces of nature. And they're usually framed as normal stories where things happen normally, and Thor gets his ass handed to him on a few instances, and then it reveals itself to be, the people, the giants and the people that you were tackling with were not what they appeared to be. They were forces of nature that you could never quite make a dent on, even with your incredible power. He does say that the cup that you were trying to drink was the sea. You couldn't.
Yes,
you made an ebb on it, but you couldn't drink all of it. He does.
You should be proud of the fact you grappled with it almost. Not that you didn't get to conquer it because of the sea.
Yeah, he does say that the cat you tried to. I didn't quite understand that. The cat you tried to lift was. What does he say about that? He's some sort of a snake that coils all around the earth.
Yeah, I think it was their conception it was the Norse conception of what the earth actually is, right?
Oh, okay. So you're trying to lift the earth, and you obviously could never do that.
Yeah, like they believe the snake coiled around the base of the earth, like the rock of the earth or something.
Yeah, the old woman you tried to wrestle, which is what I find most amusing, was that the old woman you tried to wrestle was death. And I find that amusing because the giants are all acting like they could wrestle the old lady very easily, but the story clearly mentions that no one can wrestle the old lady because she is death. Not even gods can wrestle her, because even the gods are perceptible to death, which is different than Greeks, I believe, because Greeks believe the gods were immortal.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's definitely a juncture. I'm not sure if there's anything else. I think I've covered everything I really want to cover from this lecture.
Yep. And we even covered how he views Odin as a god and how he justifies Odin as a god. And he believes that the ancient people in their own way were true and sane. That's an exact quote. And he begins the essay by putting everything in this thing called he calls hierarchy. I don't know if that's an actual word.
No, I think that's
Carlyle made it up.
Pure Carlylism. I think he's trying to say hierarchy with hierarchy. I think he's trying to be a bit clever there.
We might have to use that word in the next few lecture we're talking about. I think it's cool.
Yeah, it's not a bad one.
Yeah, all ranks are a matter of hierarchy. So yeah, that is how in the first chapter we get the idea of hero as God, and how people came to see a man as God. And if you look, nature itself is full of wonders, and the biggest wonder is man, basically. If you had to
and if I was trying to get takeaways, if you try to get some takeaway, right? I'm thinking, Odin is the seer. So first of all, the great man sees things that others cannot, and then also he is Wotan, so he's a movement. So he's also an actor. He's not just someone who passively sees. And then finally, that movement then needs to install into the more mundane populace some sort of code or some sort of honor system to live by. Yes. And that's the valor, the idea of the valor coming from Odin. That would be my kind of takeaway of what Odin's doing.
And if you don't believe in it, that shows how little you view man and how little you view yourself, in his opinion. So yes, that is how we covered the god as hero as God. And in the next chapter, and also the next episode of the podcast, we will be covering hero as prophet, which is interesting because it's whoever I asked said either Jesus or delved into talking about Buddha.
They were afraid to go to cut at the heart of it, wasn't it?
No, they didn't think that it would be Muhammad because he's a British guy from the 1840s.
Yes. It'll be interesting. I'm interested to know what you have to say on that as well. Okay, I'm going to end the broadcast then. See you guys. Hope you enjoyed it.
See you next week.